glad that you joined us tonight. Tonight our guests are Dr. William Johnson, the editor of the Adventist Review, the official organ of the Seventh-day Adventist denomination, and Dr. Walter Martin, who is well known for many of his writings on the cults, as well as contemporary religious philosophy today in our country. Gentlemen, we're glad that you're here, and I thought that on the topic of Seventh-day Adventism, Dr. Johnson, the man that is sitting next to you, in your book that you put out in '57, Questions on Doctrine, that was the official statement of the Seventh-day Adventist denomination to non-Adventists, to the world in a sense. There was a compliment to the guy sitting next to you, namely that you appreciated the fact that when he, with other scholars from other non-Adventist churches, came to you and asked questions, you appreciated the fact that he came to you directly. He came to the denomination and did research. And Walter, I'd like for you to kind of go back as we start. How did you get into going to the denomination? What was that process and what happened?
Well, I was doing research on the various cults of the time, and I'd written a book, The Rise of the Cults, and I received a letter from Leroy Froom, top Seventh-day Adventist scholar and historian, the man who wrote The Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers and other books. And he took issue with me over the classification of Seventh-day Adventism as a cult. And I contacted him back again, and I said I was sorry he took issue, but that I had quite a bit of information which indicated to me that they were. And he said, well, it wasn't accurate. So I went to Dr. Barnhouse, who was the editor of Eternity magazine. I worked for Eternity at the time. And I said, this is a very responsible man, and I think we ought to investigate this. And Dr. Barnhouse said, why don't you go down to Washington and talk with them? But I know they're a cult because I grew up in Mountain View, California, and I met with them all the time out there, and they were always giving me the mark of the beast and everything else. He said, you're wasting your time. He said, don't bother.
But you went down to Washington.
Oh, yeah, I went down there, and I met with Roy Allen Anderson, who was the editor of the Ministry magazine at the time, and the head of all Seventh-day Adventist ministers and missionaries throughout the world. And then I met with W.E. Reed, who was a special consultant to the General Conference, Leroy Froom, and T.E. Unruh, who had gotten the whole thing started by discussing with us also in Pennsylvania, where we were headquartered, some of the things about Adventism.
Tell us what your conclusion was.
I came out with the conclusion in 1956, and Eternity magazine came out with the conclusion that Seventh-day Adventists who acknowledged the things that their denomination were telling us had to be regenerate Christians and evangelicals and could not be classified as a cult. However, there were Adventists that were on the other side of the fence, and we recognized them too. We spent the time down there going over their literature, which was a morass of contradictions and materials that could be juxtaposed back and forth, either cultic or non-cultic, depending upon who wrote it. We had to go through that with a whole group of scholars and men from their publishing houses and theologians to sift through all of the materials. And the result of it, I propounded a series of questions to them. And the series was later put into the book, which you mentioned before, Questions on Doctrine. It was the first time that a non-Adventist scholar and expert on the cults had gone to the Adventists, sat down with them, discussed their theology openly, frankly, and freely. And I believe to this day, the men I dealt with on the committee, and Reuben Figuer, and the theologians who work with us were thoroughly honest men.
I was just in theological college when Walter was dialoguing with our leaders, and in fact we studied Questions on Doctrine. 57 was my first year in school down in Avondale, Australia, and we went through that book very carefully. It was applauded by the teachers there, and then later I became a teacher. I taught for 20 years in the Adventist school system, lastly in the seminary for 5 years, where I was associate dean also, and that book has been highly regarded. In terms of the controversy, John, there was some disagreement when it came out.
Why? What was the disagreement about?
Remember, I'm just telling you what I've been told.
Right.
I wasn't around here in the States. One man in particular, M.L. Andreasen, was not invited to be part of the dialogue. He took strong exception to some of the things in there. I think the two that I've heard mentioned over and over have been the nature of Christ, the human nature of Christ, and then some statements relative to the atonement, the use of that word atonement. And he became quite irate, I would say, and he sent out literature opposing the book, and some people agreed with him. He got a certain following. However, by and large, I don't think that was a large following. Now, that's my assessment. In terms of the denomination's stand on the book, we have not repudiated questions on doctrine. The book went through 8 printings, 150,000 copies. Now, that's a lot of copies. Mm-hmm. It is still used in college classes. Some people feel it ought to be reprinted. We can get into that. There is another theological volume of Seventh-day Adventist biblical theology in process, and we can discuss that. I think that's a major reason why we are not reprinting questions on doctrine. But categorically, I can tell you, the leadership of the Seventh-day Adventist Church has not repudiated questions on doctrine.
Okay, well, let's plunge in here. Walter, why don't you maybe start us off with some of the questions that you have already submitted to the denomination, because you are saying that you've heard some things and you are reassessing what you were told the first time around, as well as some of the contemporary events that are happening right now. Where would you like to start tonight?
I think that you have to begin with the background we have already, and also with the fact that the Seventh-day Adventist denomination today, to whom I addressed my questions, responded quite differently than the denomination in 1956.
How so?
In 1956, Reuben Figuer, who considered questions on doctrine and the dialogue, he said, to be the most important single contribution of his entire tenure as president. Mm-hmm. Reuben Figuer began, in his later life, to deplore the fact that there was a strong movement within Seventh-day Adventism to undercut what they had worked so hard to establish in questions on doctrine. And so I, after a number of ex-Adventist ministers came to me, after I received literally hundreds and hundreds of letters, documents, boxes full of documents from all over the world, Australia, New Zealand, England, the United States, you name it, they're stacked up that we had to go through, with people doing research on this subject. And they all were telling the same story, these ministers and these people all over the world. They were saying, we believe questions on doctrine. We cited questions on doctrine. We presented our views in the light of questions on doctrine, and we were disfellowshipped. We were removed from the church. I'm now painting houses, and I was a former teacher. I was doing this. Now I'm doing such and such. What went wrong? So I thought it would be a good idea to ask the question, what went wrong? So I addressed 3 questions to Neil Wilson.
Who is the president?
The president of the General Conference.
Okay.
Mr. Wilson didn't have time to discuss it with me, so he referred me to somebody else who didn't have apparently the time to discuss it either, and they referred me to somebody else. By the time I did get a response, the first question, I asked 3 questions, 3 primary questions. I asked them the question that I thought was tremendously important, which is, do you still hold to questions on doctrine? And the answer was yes, same as Mr. Johnson has said. I thought, that's strange. All these people can't be wrong, or something's wrong.